All right, good morning, everybody. How you guys doing? Happy Friday. Who's ready for the weekend? No? Weren't you ready?
I'm working the frosh soft dance tonight. That's just like, I'm training my roommate, so it's gonna be interesting.
Where's that at?
He's like, what?
Where's it at?
Young.
Okay.
It's on the grass behind Young. I just found out there's a lighting guy coming in, so I need to give power for him, but we're very
Okay.
limited on the power.
Yeah.
And I need to somehow power two speakers and two subwoofers,
Okay.
limited power, and a lighting guy that I've never met, so
Yeah.
it'll be fun.
Sounds like a challenge.
No,
No.
no, this is like really easy compared
Okay.
to other things. But
That's
yeah,
good.
it's fun.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Good. All right. You guys ready to be done with this semester? How you guys feeling? Feeling some, feeling that feeling from some of you guys. How's it? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. That's his like, what are you doing, Betsy? I don't know what she's doing right now. What are you doing? She's getting all hyper. All right, well, guess we can continue, huh? Gotta finish it up. How many weeks we got left? 7, 6? Nobody's counting? No? All you graduating seniors are supposed to be like counting down the days. No? Is that 5? 5 weeks after this one? Okay, yeah. But 12 or something, yeah, the semester, yeah, something like that,
No,
yeah.
it can't be 12, then we only have 3 weeks left.
11, yeah, maybe 11. What is it, guy? Okay, I knew some, including the weekend, okay, I knew somebody was counting, for sure. Okay, all right. Okay, well, today we're gonna finish up the stuff on resistance training. And then, then Monday we'll start the aerobic adaptations exercise. And so we'll have a quiz for that material on Monday and keep going. Remember that your draft for your concept map is due next Friday. So yeah, we'll be working on that a little bit so you can get some feedback for that for your final project. Okay, any questions on anything? Okay. All right. Okay, so we're talking about hypertrophy and talked about these 3 things already: genetic influences, hormonal influences. And so now we'll talk about this one here: damage from exercise. Okay, and this kind of gets at one of the questions on the quiz, which was what kind of puts more strain on the muscle? Is it eccentric contractions versus concentric contractions? And then is it eccentric contractions, faster or slower, or those types of things? And so we'll talk about that. One of the main factors, and we've talked about this already, is that eccentric contractions definitely put more tension on muscle than concentric contractions do. This is looking at muscle load, so it's really like tension of the muscle. And we can see if 100% of the load is right about there, right, then we can see that we get somewhere around 50 to 75% more strain on our muscle during eccentric contractions than we do during concentric. Okay, the interesting part about that is we actually activate our motor units less during eccentric contractions. Okay, so if you put an EMG on somebody during eccentric contraction versus concentric, we'd see lower electrical activity during the eccentric phase, but more strain. Okay, and so a big part of that, the tension in eccentric contractions, is simply just stretching out the connective tissue, stretching out those tightened proteins, right? And relying on the elastic component of muscle, and not so much the dynamic active part. So it puts more strain on the muscle without as much contraction that we think of. So so all of that leads to more tension, which leads to more damage. And this is why eccentric contractions are so crucial for hypertrophy. And this is one of the biggest problems with space flight and people spending time on the International Space Station is because without as much gravity, you don't have as much force being needed for eccentric contractions, right? And so they've created these devices that can mimic eccentric loading, like on a bike, like stationary bikes that actually like push against you, that you have to kind of resist instead. And so they have those types of exercise devices on the International Space Station to try to mimic eccentric loading, because otherwise muscle is going to atrophy without eccentric loading for sure, even though no matter how much concentric you can do, if you don't have any if you don't have much eccentric loading, you'll start to atrophy for sure. Yeah.
Are there any like significant deficits on like, because obviously like you can exercise, you know, a couple hours a day, like in space, right? Astronauts are like really busy, but like the everyday, like day-to-day just living in space, your body not having just a general pull and like your muscles not having general pull throughout the day, the everyday movements.
Yeah.
Does that have like significant deficits also?
It does. Yeah, that's a big part of it for sure. Is you just have less overall stimulus on your whole musculoskeletal system, just from your daily life for all of those 24 hours a day, just having less kind of, stress on your bones, stress on your muscle. Bone density goes down in space as well. And so, that's why they limit the amount of time people can spend on the space station and stuff. And a lot of it's just for health reasons. There's lots of health outcomes that we don't quite know how to get around yet. And so yeah, it's super interesting, but a lot of research goes into that. And a lot of exercise physiologists work for NASA for that reason, trying to figure out how to handle these types of things. So I'm probably SpaceX now, but yeah. So yeah. So other questions on that stuff? All right. So if we look at a microscopic image of skeletal muscle, right? Here's skeletal muscle kind of pre-intense eccentric exercise, and then after intense eccentric exercise. This is kind of the classic look, and it's known as Z-line streaming. Okay, so those Z lines are kind of those striated lines that go straight down through muscle. Those serve as the anchor points for the sarcomeres, right? And so what we see after intense eccentric exercise is those Z lines are not straight anymore. They get pulled in different directions. So we get this kind of streaming effect throughout the sarcomeres. And that's really the micro damage that we have with resistance training, right? So it's not like we're like fully tearing muscle, but there's kind of this internal straining that happens to the protein components in the muscle. And that's what is going to stimulate the most hypertrophy is that micro tears. So so when it comes to this, your book had a nice little image on what the body does when you have damage, right? When you have this kind of micro tear, there's kind of two options, right? So we have these little satellite cells we talked about before. If we have muscle injury, whether that's a large muscle injury like a strain or a micro tear like we we're just talking about, that leads to waking up of satellite cells, right? We had all these kind of quiescent satellite cells sitting around our muscle cells. And so the part of the injury response process is making those wake up. So they get activated, they start proliferating, we get more of those satellite cells. And then really there's kind of a split, there is a split that happens right here, right? Either those satellite cells could fuse with a muscle cell that's already there, right? And like that's what we talked about on Wednesday, add another nucleus to that muscle cell, right? And that's really what hypertrophy is, right? Or what leads to hypertrophy. Or we can get a bunch of those satellite cells aligned together and then create a new skeletal muscle cell, right? And that's really what would cause hyperplasia, right? So we got those two options. And as far as we know, hypertrophy plays the biggest role for sure in our strength increases, but there is quite a bit of research around hyperplasia, and it probably looks like there's some hyperplasia that happens too. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end of class today, but yeah, there probably is some hyperplasia. We'll talk about some of the evidence here in a minute. So probably both, but hypertrophy plays the biggest role in the strength increases. Okay, so one of the things that is connected to all of this is what causes muscle soreness, right? So creatine kinase is something that we can measure in the blood. to see if we have muscle damage, right? And so this is before exercise here, creatine kinase levels, after exercise here, right? And then up to 2 days after exercise, we can see that after intense exercise, we can have a spike in creatine kinase levels. Why would that be? What do you guys think? Why would we see more creatine kinase in the blood after intense resistance training? Where's it coming from? John?
Is it normally supposed to be in the muscle cells, and then when it's like damaged, it comes out of the muscle cells?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. This is a marker of skeletal muscle damage because we don't have much of it floating around in our blood normally. But if all of a sudden we have more, then that's because skeletal muscles broke open a little bit, right, and spilled some of it out, right? And so we see this with heart attacks too, right? Some of you I know have worked as EMTs or worked on ambulances, taken patients to the hospital. What are some markers that they look for heart attacks in the blood? Yeah, troponin's a big one, right? Troponin C, which is part of muscle, right? It's not just part of skeletal muscle, it's also part of cardiac muscle. So we see some of that spilling out in the blood with a heart attack, but they can also at times look at creatine kinase as well, but troponin is pretty much standard to look at. So, but it's the same idea that if muscle cells are broken, then they're going to spill things out into the blood, then we're going to have more of something in the blood that we wouldn't normally have. Yeah, so that's just kind of a marker. And what we see is that muscle damage goes right along with soreness too, right? So back to this whole idea of like what causes soreness, right? It's not the lactate. We talked about that. It's not the lactate, but it is actual muscle damage, which then connects to inflammation, right? Because this stimulates the inflammatory process. Okay, so really the steps that would lead to soreness would be we would get some damage to muscle, right, due to tension, right, due to tension, okay, and then we get a bunch of stuff that spills out of those cells, so cell contents. Betsy found something on the ground she's licking. she does this during exams every time too. I have an exam this afternoon, that's why I have her with me, but she'll usually find something and just like licking and snorting, and it's like super quiet in the classroom, so everybody hears it. So cell contents can then spill out into the interstitial space, and those cell contents are what stimulate the immune system. Yeah, so then that calls in all those immune cells, right? We get what's called chemotaxis. Right, that's just like all those immune cells aggregating towards the site of injury, right? And then they're going to kind of do what we talked about in atherosclerosis, that same process of starting inflammation, releasing cytokines, bringing more immune cells in, and that's going to lead to some stimulation of pain receptors in some way. Stimulate nociceptors. And so we get pain, right? So that's really just kind of trying to connect that back to the soreness. Why does this lead to soreness? Okay. Questions on that? Interpreting my writing, questions? No?
It's kind of funny that it took us so long to figure out the source.
Yeah, kind of makes it's like a more of an obvious answer than the lactic acid is, right? Yeah, it's like, of course, yeah. Right, yeah, lactic acid felt more like more complicated, right? Like it's kind of yeah, but yeah, that's a great point. It feels like more of the go-to answer. Yeah. So, yeah, and it makes sense too, because like when our muscle is a little bit damaged, it's weaker, right? And we need to actually have some time to let it rest and heal. And that's what pain does for us, right? Pain makes us not use it anymore, right? And that's kind of the whole point of that pain is to limit our movement, our use of it, so that tissue can heal. Right? So it all definitely makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions on that? Okay, so I want to walk through kind of some things for you guys to talk about here in a sec. And this is kind of the question we'll come back to when we think about how do we cause kind of the most damage to muscle, which might not necessarily be our goal, but if we want to lead to some damage to muscle to cause some hypertrophy, what should we do? Should we put as much weight on the bar as we can and maybe not go through our full range of motion? Or should we put the right amount of weight on the bar that we could take it through the full range of motion and go through the full length of contraction? Okay, we're not answering that question yet, but I want to frame that question around this activity of doing dips. Okay, how many people do dips as part of their normal routine or have done as part of their normal routine? Okay, all right, so that's helpful to have a few of you that have done this. So let's picture yourself as somebody who hasn't done dips really at all, and then you decide you're going to go out and do 3 sets of 10 or 15 or something dips. Okay. What I want you to think about with the people on your team, or maybe you guys can join up, and yeah, we got a few. Alex is on his own as far as his team goes today. But yeah, I want you to think about these 3 things. If we're thinking about these 2 muscles, triceps and pecs, okay, those are the 2 main muscles that will be worked pretty significantly with dips. Okay, which of those 2 would burn the most during the workout? Okay, while you're doing the dips, which of these is stretched more, like taken more to its full range of motion, and then which of these would get more soreness? And we're talking about DOMs, right? So like 48 hours, 72 hours after the workout, which of these you think will be more sore? Okay, so talk through those 3 questions with the people around you, and yeah, you can answer with one of those 2 muscles for each. We'll come back together in a few minutes and talk about it. Betsy's got a buddy.
It's not, it's like no.
In order to get like more.
You guys get down that far when you do a dip? Yeah. It's hard to get down that far though, huh? You won't even pass that? Really? Yeah. That feels almost like your shoulders start getting unstable at that point. Yeah. It's got it all figured out?
Are we assuming that the person's perfect form?
How about a form like that?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's an example.
It's pretty good form, right? Yeah. I don't know if I could do many dips, so I went down that far. Yeah.
Like perfect 90 degrees.
I know, right? Yeah. That's why I chose that picture. She's definitely going down all the way. Yeah. Okay. So let's have you guys just vote on the first one. Okay. Which one do you think? Just give me a 1 or a 2 would burn the most during exercise, each team here. Okay. So we got some saying pecs, some saying triceps, pecs. What'd you guys say? Triceps. You guys said triceps. So we're kind of mixed, a few more triceps. The way that I would frame that question would be, and of course, the way you do these and your own experience might differ slightly from this. But the way that I would frame this is, of the 2 muscles, like which one are we putting at a greater percentage of its max during the exercise, right? And so since the triceps are smaller, a smaller muscle, I would kind of contest that the weaker link out of those 2 muscles would be the triceps. So that might put them at a greater percentage of their max. So then that might make them produce more lactic acid and get some more of that burning that happens. What was your guys' conversation on that? I'm curious, because especially 2 of you are the ones that said you do dips, and you guys chose pecs on that. So I'm curious what you guys talked about with that. Just from your own experience. Yeah.
I think it also just depends on which position, like if you're doing it that way or.
Yeah. Yeah. definitely. For sure. Range of motion and position is huge. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. And then let's vote again. Which one is stretched the most? Triceps or pecs here? Okay. So we're in agreement on that one. Everybody says the pecs are stretched more, right? Because we all know that the triceps also, the triceps also cross the shoulder. And so we would need to, when you stretch your triceps, you're going this way, but that's really just the one head. But also we're never getting all the way down to here when we do a dip, right? We would probably never be able to come back up if we went that far down. But yeah, so we can agree on that one. The pecs are more stretched. So then let's vote here. Which one do we get more sore with? As far as DOMS goes, one or two. What do you guys think? 3. Which one gets sore? And you have different muscle? Shoulders? Is that what you're thinking? You rotator cuff? Yeah. Yeah.
The only issue, not issue, question, but
Yeah.
the reason why it's kind of hard is it kind of depends which is necessarily your stronger muscle.
In that person.
Yeah. 'Cause
Yeah.
It's I used to always had much stronger triceps and chest in the past. So my chest would start burning first. Get sore first.
Okay. Yeah.
And so it's it kind of just depends.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, but most of the time it would be triceps too.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's totally. Yeah, I totally agree. It's not a perfectly black and white answer at all, for sure. Just to kind of make the point that I'm trying to make, which is that since the pecs are stretched more, we put them at more of their full range of motion here than we do the triceps. That at times this can be the one that you can get some more damage in during the exercise, right? And so yeah, and it can be the case too that maybe the muscle that you're working out in an exercise that burns the most isn't always the one that ends up getting the most sore. Can be that way, but it's not always that way. And this could be an example in some cases where that is the case, where triceps are burning the most, but actually the one that gets more sore is the one that you put on a greater stretch. So then kind of back to this question here. Again, if we're comparing, and this goes right to that, right? If we're not really strong enough to go all the way down into a dip, or we don't have if we don't have the strength or coordination to go all the way down into a dip, then we might not put our pecs on as much of a stretch, right? And then we might end up we might end up getting more soreness with our triceps. But if we go all the way down like this, for sure, then we are putting more strain on the pecs, and we're taking them more to their full range of motion. And so that could lead to more DOMs there in the pecs, which just kind of takes us back to this, that most likely this is the more important component when it comes to overall tension we're putting on a muscle, which would be the overall stimulus that we get for hypertrophy would probably be, the length that we actually put that muscle at, versus this one here, which, so we could put a lot more weight on the bar if we're just going to go up and down like this, right? Versus putting less weight. But here we might end up getting more sore if we have less weight, but we take it all the way down with the bench press instead of more weight and just doing something like this, right? So that's kind of part of that. Yeah.
So would you say longer reps at a lower weight would be better than high reps at a high weight, essentially? I don't know. That'd be produce a better result than more weight?
Yeah, I mean, in general, it's a lot of the older recommendations for hypertrophy were always lower reps. But a lot of that has kind of morphed into not such a stringent recommendation that way. Even for hypertrophy, a lot of the recommendations are still moving more towards 10 reps, whereas before it would 15 years ago or so, it was always 3 to 6 reps for maximal hypertrophy. But a lot of that has kind of morphed to expand. But I think the most important part is, are we pushing ourselves to something like a 10 rep max or something? So we have enough weight on there that we can, or small enough amount of weight that we can go full range, but enough weight that pushes us to maxing out in about 8 to 10 reps or something like that. So we want to get maximal strain on the muscle without hurting ourselves, but to give enough stimulus to get that hypertrophy. So that would be my take. But yeah, other thoughts on that? I know some of you, yeah, do some of this stuff on your own too. So other thoughts on that? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions about this or other comments about this idea of yeah, weight lifted versus length of contraction? Yeah, I mean, most personal trainers wouldn't recommend somebody to, or strength coaches wouldn't never recommend somebody to go halfway down, right, and come back up, right? We usually want to go full range of motion. And the big reason for that is that strain on the muscle. So part of that percent, why that percent strain or length of the muscle is the primary factor for muscle damage, is because when we get stretched out like this, right? So when our sarcomeres get fully stretched out, we're no longer able to rely on all the same amount of actin and myosin interaction, right? Because we've got all these myosin heads that aren't touching actin anymore, right? So now we're putting more strain on the elastic component of muscle, connective tissue part of it, right? And that's really what puts a lot of strain on our muscle. And yeah, and so we kind of, it's kind of like we're just putting the muscle to a greater percent of its maximal ability to produce force, and we're making it do that not so much with the active components, but with those connective tissue components, which stretches out the muscle a lot and can cause those little micro tears. Okay, questions on any of that? Okay, so let's let's take a sec here and just have you guys kind of recap what we talked about as far as hypertrophy goes. So the genetics part, the hormones we talked about, kind of muscle damage and repair, and that these 5 steps would kind of include combining the soreness part with the kind of satellite cell activation part that we talked about. Okay, so talk about that with the people around you, kind of fill this in, and then we'll come back together here in a sec.
Yeah. It's after we say we'll- it's just like, yeah. All right, cool.
That George's strategy, dealing with you two
Yeah.
hooligans.
Let us get wrong, so that she.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Test the water.
Nice. All right, guys, let's go ahead and come back together here. Okay, so the one gene that we talked about, what was it called? Okay, myostatin. And then if we have a lot of myostatin, what does that mean for our ability to hypertrophy? Not so much, right? Yeah, so it's a negative growth factor. Okay. The one catabolic hormone we talked about? Cortisol, okay. And why is that important that we get some cortisol released during and after, right after exercise? Say it again.
Slight relief.
Relief? What do you mean?
Like, I'm thinking more like cortisol injections.
Oh, just like dealing
Yeah,
with kind of
like
the stress of
anti-inflammatory
exercise.
stuff.
Okay, part of it. What, when we kind of specifically are thinking about like building muscle, what does cortisol do to help us build muscle? Georgia?
It's for converting like, or creating more amino acids and then free fatty acids.
Yeah, for sure. So fuel availability really is the big deal. Right? If it causes us to break down protein, then we get more amino acid availability. If it causes us to break down fat, we get more free fatty acids available. All these things that we need to repair cells and build up cells, we need all those, and we get more glucose available as well. So all that's going to help us drive ATP production, drive protein synthesis, be able to build muscle. Okay, and then the anabolic ones we talked about, what are they? Okay, testosterone, estrogen, yeah, and then growth hormone. And then growth hormone leads to the release of another one that actually causes a growth. What was that one? Yeah, the insulin-like growth factors, right? So IGF-1 would be the most important one. Yeah. Okay. All right, and then as far as the muscle damage and repair part goes, kind of what we already talked about, but just putting those two things together. Okay, so we got damage due to eccentric contractions. All right, so we're going to get all these cell contents that spill out. And when they do that, they stimulate the immune system. Okay, but they also lead to, so that would cause some chemotaxis of the immune system. We also get chemotaxis of satellite cells. Right, so the satellite cells kind of aggregate towards that damaged muscle. Okay, and then those cells can either add to old cells or make a new cell. All right, this one's hypertrophy. This one's hyperplasia. So then obviously our end result is just larger muscle. Okay. Questions about any of those or questions about any of the stuff I wrote? Give you guys another sec. See some of you still writing stuff down. All right. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about atrophy and then a little bit about some of the other changes we see with strength training. So atrophy is obviously just pretty much the opposite of hypertrophy, shrinking down of skeletal muscles. There's been quite a few immobilization studies, right, where they actually measure protein synthesis rates in skeletal muscle around a joint that has been immobilized, right? We see protein synthesis starting to decrease within 6 hours of immobilization. And so we're kind of switching from building up or at least maintaining with protein synthesis rates in skeletal muscle to going the opposite direction of decreasing within just 6 hours of putting the cast on somebody, right? So it's like, this is a huge reason why not as many things are casted as used to be, right? Because muscle just goes away so quick. That doesn't mean that your muscle starts shrinking in 6 hours. It just means that your cells kind of move from building to not building within 6 hours, right? So really quick, okay? But we do, with immobilization, we expect about a 3 to 4% decrease of strength per day in that first week of immobilization. So that's, I mean, it's incredibly efficient, right? Our bodies are just so efficient that if we're not using something, we're gonna send those resources somewhere else, right? And that's obviously much different than when you just stop training, because you're still moving, you're still living, right? Now, obviously, most of your strength that you gained in a training program can be lost if you stop. But one of the big things that's kind of a big question mark in the research, especially for athletes, is like, how do we maintain strength in off season or in an injury time, right? What kind of maintenance programs can we come up with? And obviously these are super specific to the athlete and to the injury and different things, but kind of the best way to think of it is, can we take some of those things from the FIT principle, right? Intensity, frequency, time, and maybe just dial down a couple of those factors, but leave one, right? So maybe instead of working out 5 days a week with a certain amount of intensity, we maintain that intensity, but just do it once a week, right? And that can actually sustain strength for at least a few weeks, even, yeah. And so a lot of maintenance programs look like that, where they take one piece of the FIT principle, keep it as it was, and then the other components drop down in order to give someone some rest or help recover from an injury. So yeah, obviously this is a very specific thing that depends on what we're talking about, what muscle we're talking about, but yeah.
So is that like purely in your muscle, or is any of it like neurological?
Good question. Yeah, absolutely. Those neurological adaptations go away quickly as well, for sure. Yeah, definitely. Probably quicker than the muscle does, because those things can be trained so quickly, but then they also go away quickly. And that's usually how it works. The things that we gain quickly, we also lose quickly too. We'll see that with the aerobic adaptations as well, for sure. So yeah. Other questions or thoughts on that? Has anybody played around with trying to do maintenance programming on themselves or on clients or anything? Yeah, John, you have some? Yeah. How's it work out? How does it work out? Yeah.
Sometimes, and then you get back to like your full load, and then did it really work?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. How about other people that nod their heads?
I think it's needed for like everyone to office when they do maintenance, like at least a week to like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
They just don't go crazy.
Just kind of
so
take
they
a
can
break.
Actually, like recover, if not just physically, but also like mentally.
Yeah.
But it's kind of boring.
Yeah.
It's like not fun.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. How about you in your work, Alex? Have you tried some of this with your clients? Or?
Yeah, a lot of times I'll coordinate with PTs. So when we have somebody come in who's recently injured and needs surgery, I'll do some like maintenance beforehand, like strength buildings.
Like the prehab kind of thing, yeah.
To minimize that.
Yeah, okay, cool, yeah, that's great. Yeah, cool. All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about the hyperplasia side of things. Again, this is adding cells, right? Instead of just making cells bigger, we're adding more cells. And we already talked about satellite cells involvement in this. But let's talk about a couple of the lines of research that actually have shown this. One of the lines of research is cross-sectional studies. Okay, so cross-sectional study means that it's not an intervention, right? It's like we take a bunch of elite weightlifters and we get a muscle biopsy on them, we count their cells, and then we do the same thing with somebody who doesn't train at all, count their cells and see who's got more cells, right? That's a cross-sectional type study. And those studies do tend to show that people that do a lot of weightlifting, elite weightlifters, have more muscle cells than people that don't. And so that could be that, it could be that like genetically they had more muscle cells, so they became weightlifters, right? It could be that way. Or it could be that because they trained for so long, they had more muscle cells. We don't know that answer in a cross-sectional study, but those do tend to be pretty consistent in that way. But one of the things that's tough about this kind of research is you're literally counting muscle cells under a microscope. And that's literally what they do. So most of the time, if you see these studies on humans, they will, the process of the study, if you read sometimes in the methods, they'll kind of explain like the data collection was started this year and went through these times. It can take years to complete 3 to 5 subjects in one of these studies, because the way they do it is obviously it's well, so when they do this in animals, they can take the whole muscle out and count every single muscle cell in that muscle group. In humans, obviously we don't do that. So they take a muscle sample out, or a muscle biopsy, count the amount of cells in that biopsy, and then try to extrapolate that out over the whole size of the muscle, right? And so you can imagine that extrapolation process, there's a lot of error in that, right? And it's just a lot of error in counting literally hundreds of thousands of muscle cells. Like it's not on the level of like 10 or 20, it's like hundreds of thousands in a sample, right? And so they're counting those, and then they got to count them multiple times to double check, make sure they're getting it right, and then taking the average. So it's incredibly tedious research, and there's a lot of error in it too. So so that's kind of some of the difficulties in the research. But there are some groups that have pretty clearly shown that even with interventional studies in humans, that it seems to be that we do get an increase in cell number with kind of long-term resistance training. Probably not a huge amount, but it seems to be some. Some of the kind of more definitive evidence in animals. This was a study that was done on cats, and it's kind of definitely a bit cruel in a way, but they pretty much train these cats to push down on this little thing that has a weight on it, right? And that's how they get their food, right? But they make this like a progressive weightlifting program pretty much where it just gets harder and harder. It takes more reps as they put more weight on, right? And it's like not like a little thing, like they made it super intense for these cats. So they're like working out like all day long in order to get food, right? And so then they pretty much, you can have genetically identical cats, and some of them do the lifting, some of them don't, right? And then they take out the whole muscle, whole forearm muscle, whatever ones they're using, and count the muscle cells in those genetically identical cats, and like control versus the weightlifting ones. And they saw clear hyperplasia in these types of studies. So that's the cat one. This one can happen due to stretching. There's some pretty cruel ones that researchers did with birds, where they like tie something to the end of their wing and like stretch their wing out like for long periods of time. And that also leads to hyperplasia as well. And there's something about muscle fibers that actually split when they're stretched out to a great degree. And so nothing like that's ever been replicated in humans to know if that would actually work in a human. I don't know why you would want to, but unless you just want to get more flexibility, maybe that could give you more flexibility, but it's just another way that they've seen some hyperplasia. But yeah, so kind of not very nice to the animals in these studies. And in all these studies, they have to kill the animals afterwards, right? That's just how it works, because that's the only way they get the full muscle out, right? I mean, yeah, so that's the way all of this type of research is done. I didn't really think that much of that research was still done, but when I was at the University of Virginia with my master's, there was a cardiovascular physiologist there, and he did most of his research on dogs, actually. And so, yeah, some of my colleagues had gone into his lab at different times, and like there'd be like a dog like laid out on the table, like with the chest open, doing like full like open heart surgery on dogs, like to test out all kinds of things. But yeah, there's still a lot of animal research like that that's done, even in this country and lots in other countries as well. So yeah. Not something I'd want to be involved in, but it does exist. So, yeah. Okay, any questions about hyperplasia or anything related? Okay, all right, well then the last thing we'll talk about is fiber type changes, because that's definitely a part of adaptations to resistance training. If we combine both kind of high intensity interval type work, which is more aerobic, with resistance training, then we can tend to see this type of change where we actually can turn type 1 muscle fibers into type 2A muscle fibers, okay? And that's a larger like genetic shift, right? Because that's actually expressing the faster type of myosin ATPase. Still a lot of mitochondria in those muscle cells, but just getting a totally different type of myosin ATPase. So those muscle cells are faster now, but also very oxidative. Just pure resistance training, we tend to see changes within the type 2 fibers, like we talked about before, moving from type 2X to type 2A. That's just packing in more mitochondria into those fast fibers that are already fast, right? But just making them more oxidative. So yeah, so those are the kind of changes we would expect to see some. And again, this isn't going to take somebody who's 90% type 1 and switch them over to 90% type 2. It doesn't work that way, but we might get a 10 to 15% shift or something like that with some training. So yeah, all right. Well, I think we're good to go. Have a great weekend, guys. See you guys on Monday.